friends, my name is Jess. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing my June wrap up. So I started off June in kind of a reading slump. The end of May and the first week or two of June were I couldn't get into anything. I didn't like anything that I started reading. I read a few chapters and I would drop everything. Thankfully, I got out of that reading slump and I still read a decent number of books in my opinion. I attempted to read 8 books, one of which I DNF'd. 1 book was a 3-star read, 4 were 4-star reads, and then 2 were 5-star reads. As usual, I've organized the books based on their rating from the lowest rated, or in this case, the DNF, up to the highest rated book. And then within each star rating category, I've vaguely organized them based on how much I liked them from least to most liked. So let's start with the DNF. From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I feel like there are people who are gonna disagree with this because I know there are so many people who really love From Blood and Ash, but I don't think there's gonna be people who don't understand why I did this. So From Blood and Ash is a vampire romance set in a world where the kingdom is threatened by the previously overthrown group of what I think are essentially vampires and werewolves. Our main character Poppy is the Maiden, which is a very revered but extremely isolated and restricted role in the kingdom. And as she approaches this pivotal ceremony in her life called the Ascension, a new handsome guard known as Hawk joins her protection detail. I DNF'd this book at 50% and just decided to read a recap of the other 50% online. That was better than me having finished the book. I was bored out of my mind. Literally the only reason I even made it to 50% is because I was really trying to read this book for the Winers Book Club. I couldn't do it. It felt like every time I looked at the page count for this book and how many pages I had left to read, the page count just got bigger and bigger every time I looked at it, I swear to God. From Blood and Ash had no business being as long as it is. Because what really happened? What happened in this book? Nothing. Nothing happened in the first half. By that point in the book, at the 50% mark, I still have no idea how the fantasy element of this book works. I don't understand what these creatures are. We've had basically no plot twists revealed. And if a book had at least, sounded pretty, even if it was empty, maybe I could have handled it, but the writing was meh. Average at best, cliched at worst. There was an overabundance of ellipses, especially in the beginning. And I kid you not, Jennifer L. Armentrout literally used the phrase, "My smile turned upside down." What? It was so stupid. And you know what? I expected that. I expected this to be kind of a stupid plot, kind of a stupid book. I expected it to be poorly written because that's not what people read From Blood and Ash for. At least I don't think so. That's not what I've heard people read it for. They read it for the steamy romance that I was promised. And at 50%, we did not have that. I think by that point we had had a few kisses, some little fondling, things like that. And all of that happened in the first, 2 or 3 chapters. So the rest of it was basically nothing. I guess some people would call it a slow burn and maybe they would enjoy the tension between the characters, but the issue is that in my opinion there was no tension. There was no chemistry between these characters, and maybe a part of it is just because the characters to me felt so bland. I did not care enough to get through the rest of the book. I read the recap and wouldn't you know it, everything that I had predicted would happen happened according to the recap. Yeah, the plot twists in this book are a straight line. We're just gonna move on. The one 3-star book I read was The 3-Body Problem by Cixin. This is a classic Chinese sci-fi book set during and after the Cultural Revolution that happened in China in the 60s and the 70s. The premise built off of reality, focusing on the fact that Earth has sent out information and calls out into space, searching for intelligent life. And this book takes that further and speculates on what could happen if intelligent life does in fact exist out there, hears our messages, and decides to invade Earth. I was really looking forward to this book because the premise really intrigued me. That question of well, what if there is intelligent life out there listening to our messages was a really intriguing question to me. But unfortunately, this book was just tedious to read. I mentioned this in my May wrap up, but I categorize my sci-fi novels based on a scale from 1 to 3, based on amount of science discussed in the book and how easy that science is for the average person to understand. And the 3-body problem is a level 3, which means there is a shit ton of science. It is not always easily explained. It's actually super long explanations, pages upon pages, and you can't just skim past it. Like, in order to really understand the book and what the book is trying to say and things like that, you need to understand the science and the technology discussed to some degree. I feel like I didn't actually understand like 70% of what I read. There were so many passages where I had to reread them in order to really try to grasp what they were talking about. And don't get me wrong, I think I'm a relatively intelligent person. Like, I usually understand basically what sci-fi novels are talking about enough that I can grasp the story, but I mean, this was alive. And it wasn't what I expected. I didn't go into this book in order to read a science textbook. I wanted an edge of my seat kind of story. I wanted anticipation. I wanted fear about this alien invasion. And instead, it's a slow book. We don't actually discuss the alien invasion for quite a while. A lot of the book is actually set in this virtual reality video game where people attempt to solve the three-body problem. Basically, you're on this planet that experiences unstable conditions, and those conditions are very extreme, and we're talking like so hot that people burn up instantly kind of extreme. I actually really like video games and books, so I wasn't mad about this or anything, and it did serve as an introduction to the alien species. But again, don't expect action-packed. This video game is not like an action game or anything like that. This is a capital I intellectual book. Honestly, I mainly kept reading the book because I knew where this story was gonna end up, but I was so baffled about how we would get to that point, and I wanted to see how everything connected. But I think this book was less about the actual alien invasion. I think it was more about philosophy. This book has major critiques on the human race and the destruction that we and our technological advancements have on the world, especially on the environment. And it also talks about the destruction that humans aim at each other, and how there's a lot of evil and hypocrisy in the way that humans treat each other and other animals. I will say, I think I learned a little bit something in terms of history, because this book does start out in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which isn't something that I ever really knew about before, but I learned a little bit about the atmosphere in this book, and I ended up Googling stuff because I wanted to know more about it. In terms of learning any science, not so much. I would read some of the footnotes to try to get a better understanding of the things that they were talking about, and sometimes I wouldn't even understand the footnotes. There's more talking in this book than there is action. I mean, this book is for someone. For that person, it's very well written. Moving on to our 4-star reads, we have Always Been Here by Samra Habib. I read this book for the Nonfiction Baddies book club, I believe. This is a memoir written by a queer Muslim woman. The author, Samra Habib, opens up her memoir in her childhood when she was living in Pakistan as an Ahmadi Muslim. The Ahmadi Muslims are a sect of the religion that were, and probably still are, I honestly don't know, discriminated and threatened. So her memoir talks about that. It talks about her immigrating with her family to Canada, I believe, about an arranged marriage, about her exploration of her sexuality, and how her identity and religion interact. I honestly feel kind of uncomfortable critiquing a memoir because it's such a personal thing what authors choose to share about themselves and what they don't want to share about themselves. So I'm gonna run through this one kind of quickly. My feelings about this memoir are very neutral. I don't think I was very invested, nor do I think I disliked my time with it. I do feel like it was maybe a surface level memoir. It didn't feel like it explored her life beyond the very clear cause and effect, but it was a different perspective, and I think I walked away from it with my worldview expanded a bit. This works better as a book that explores the idea of how identity and religion work together more than I would really read it for it being a memoir, if that makes any sort of sense. There was a lot of value on the discussion that Samra Habib had about how sexuality and religion work together, because I know a lot of queer people struggle with that. For people who care very much about their beliefs, I think this is an example that you can be who you are and still find a place in your religion and find a community within that as well. So I think this would be very helpful for people, and it's a super easy story to consume. It's pretty short, so I think people are better off giving it a chance than not. Next, we've got Our Violent Ends, which is the sequel to These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This series is a historical fantasy retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai. If you want to see my thoughts on the first book, make sure to watch my May wrap-up. As for this book, I don't have very deep thoughts at all. I liked it more than I liked the first book, I think, but like the first book, it's still a book that's fun while I'm reading it, but now that I've finished it, it's just not gonna stick with me. I would read it again if I felt like in the right mood for it, so I don't mind giving this book my time, but I don't think I would go out of my way to like get a copy for myself to have on my shelves. Ironically enough, in this book though, I cared more about the relationship than I cared about the plot, which was the reverse for the first book, in which I basically didn't really really care about the relationship at all. But I think the relationship developed a lot more in this book. We had more sweet moments, more romantic moments, and I think this book has more depth to the relationship. It has more layers to it because you can see both the positive and the negatives of it. And of course, we have more than just the main romance. Like, the romances in general, just, they made me soft. They made me smile a few times in this book. We had a lot of fun tropes throughout this book, including the confession in the middle of a fight trope, which, top tier. I mentioned in my review of These Violent Delights that how I would feel about the series as a whole depended a lot on this book, on whether or not the sequel had more character growth, more development, like how the sequel wrapped up a bunch of things. And while I don't think there was a bunch of character growth, I think there was enough to satisfy me. Personally, I just don't feel like the main characters had like a huge journey. Like, I think what they did at the end of the books is totally decisions that they were capable of making in the beginning of the first book under the right circumstances. And to me, that doesn't speak a lot of character growth. I think the side characters had more of a personal journey than Juliet or Roma did, especially Juliet's cousins. Both of Juliet's cousins had a bunch of changes to their lives. Like I mentioned, I didn't really care about the plot of this book very much. I didn't care about the fantasy aspect, but I was kind of interested in the political tensions part of it, because I think we're seeing more of the historical politics that occurred in this time period and in this area than we did in the first book. Overall, very fun book, but I think I can just tell that this is the author's debut series. It's just not a very layered book. I would definitely keep reading Chloe Gong's books though. I think she has a lot of potential. Next we have Violeta by Isabel Allende. This is a historical novel following a Latin American woman named Violeta from birth throughout her 100-year-old life, as she experiences 2 pandemics, the women's rights movement, and an economic crash, among other events. The vast majority of the book takes place in a country that's like never named, but it's a pretty safe assumption that it's Chile. So Violeta is, I think, the 4th Isabel Allende book that I have read. Isabel Allende is like one of my grandmother's favorite authors ever, so I've read quite a few of her books, and in my opinion, this one is perhaps the easiest of the 4 books that I have read to read. And maybe a part of it is just the fact that I am older now when I'm reading this one for the first time versus reading the others for the first time, and so I can understand things like the politics and everything better. If you are interested in Isabel Allende, I think it's worth considering this as like an introduction to her work. This is not a fast-paced, riveting kind of story, and there really is no overarching plot because we're just following her entire life. But it is the kind of story that I think it's easy to sink into. I found that it was just really easy to keep turning the page, and before I knew it, the book was over. Something about the writing style just makes it super easy to consume it. I do want to say, Allende often writes magical realism into her books, so I expected there to be a magical realism aspect in this story, like there has been in, I'm pretty sure, all of the other 3 books that I've read by her, but there is no magical realism in this story, just so you know. The closest thing is like some of the characters using what could be called spiritual healing, but I don't really consider that magical realism. This just felt like a very real story conveyed to us through Violeta, who is telling the story to someone that she cares about. And describing exactly how I feel about this book is a little bit complicated, but I'm gonna give it a try. I think the characters feel like real people, but they feel like real people that we just don't know a lot about. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but I can tell in my heart that these characters are 3-dimensional, but at least in this book, Allende had the tendency to heavily associate each character with like pretty much one personality type. And I don't think that's necessarily not real, because you often have people in your life that you really remember for one personality trait or another, and I think that's just what happened here in Violeta's retelling of her life. Describing this book feels like one contradiction after another, to be honest. I feel like we didn't get to know the narrator, Violeta, as much as I would have wanted to. We got to know her as, for a lot of her life, a rich, privileged woman. And you're seeing things through that perspective, which is to say that she often thought that bad things that were happening to the population as a whole would never touch her. So while I feel like we learn a lot about the historical events and the atmosphere during a dictatorship, for instance, it's kind of detached, and that's kind of how I feel about Violeta herself. She talks a lot about other people and about events that happened in her life, but I don't feel like she spends that much time talking about herself. Comparatively, she doesn't spend a lot of time talking about herself. For the sake of trigger warnings though, here are some of the things that she does talk about. We we have domestic abuse, drug addiction, prostitution, the usual atrocities you would think of in a dictatorship, like torture, people disappearing, oppression of the general population, and we also mention death in childbirth. And as far as I'm aware, I think that's it. And the only other specific thing that I want to point out that, mind you, is not a trigger warning at all, it's just a thing that I want to point out. I was very surprised to see that there was an LGBT character as kind of the main cast of characters. We don't get a lot of perspective into what it is like to be an LGBT person in that time and place. It doesn't really go into it in the book, but I mean, it's cool. It's cool that they're there. All right, next, All's Well by Mona Awad. This is a horror novel following a former actress whose life has been derailed by an injury that's left her with chronic pain. Miranda is now a college theater director, desperate to put on the Shakespearean play All's Well, despite her students' displeasure with the choice. But with the help of 3 strange benefactors, Miranda gets her way. If I had to succinctly describe this book, All's Well is a revenge story. All's Well is a story about getting revenge on the doctors and the physical therapists who were annoyed by her severe pain, on the people around her who thought she was faking her pain, or who thought that she was pathetic or a burden, or all sorts of things that people who experience chronic pain have to deal with from a society who doesn't really care about people. The copy of All's Well that I read had an author's interview at the end of it that I think added a lot to my understanding of the story. So if you read All's Well, I definitely recommend reading the author's interview just to get some of Mona Awad's perspective on it. And from that interview, I learned that the depiction of Miranda's chronic pain actually comes from a similar injury that Mona Awad herself suffered. So with this book, she's pulling a lot from her personal experience with having people, especially medical professionals, ignore her pleas for help and believe that her pain wasn't true. There's very much a message here about how chronic pain isn't believed and how people, women especially, are sometimes forced to perform their pain, to put on a show for people in order to have them acknowledge that this is real. So I understand the framing of having a play at the center of it, and I think it's a very good parallel there. However, this is a niche of college that I'm not very familiar with, and so I didn't relate to it and connect to it as much as I did with Bunny. Like Bunny though, Awad does explore female relationships, especially female cruelty, and there is also a descent into madness, which is one of my favorite things to read about. I love how Awad puts us in the heads of her main characters as they're losing their minds, and as they're becoming increasingly unreliable narrators, because I always want to know what is it that other characters are seeing as the main character is telling us that everything is oh so perfect. There is always a moment where things get flipped around and you suddenly see how jarring these characters appear from the outside, and I love it every single time. It's so good. I also really enjoy the magical aspect of this story. I do think it's a little bit in your face with the message, but I don't really mind. I don't want to say more about what exactly it is because I think that probably constitutes a spoiler. So what I will say is that this story kind of reminded me of Dorian Gray. And as for the vibe of the story as a whole, while I was reading this book, I had the sudden thought that Mona Awad's books feel sticky to me. And that was like a weird thought to have at first, but I think it makes perfect sense because I don't think Awad's books are like the scary kind of horror, really. I think it's more the kind of horror that like makes you cringe and makes you try to get away from it. But the story sticks to you, it clings to you, it just makes it like hard to like get it off of you. I didn't like it as much as Bunny, but I think it's a decent follow-up. And now we're getting into our final 2 books, the 2 5-star reads, both of which are rereads. Like I mentioned at the beginning of June, I was kind of stuck in a reading slump, so I decided like the easiest way to get through it is like reread some books that I had already enjoyed. Super easy to just sit back and relax with the story I already know. And I decided to go with some LGBT reads because I hikey forgot that June was Pride Month. So I hadn't planned to read many LGBT stories, like the disaster bisexual that I am. The first book I'm going to talk about is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a historical fiction book where Evelyn Hugo, an old Hollywood starlet, decides to do a tell-all story about her life. I will admit, I liked this book more the first time that I read it. And I think I was just so enamored with it the first time that I read it that I didn't notice its flaws the way that I did now. And also, I first consumed it as an audiobook versus reading it physically this time. And I think this is a book that works better as an audiobook because it's Evelyn Hugo telling us what her life story is. So I think it's better to like hear her tell you her story. Honestly, it's like everything to do with Miranda that I didn't really like this time around. I just feel like the interactions between Miranda and Evelyn were kind of awkward, and I didn't really like any of Miranda's sections of the book. The majority of the book is just Evelyn's story that she's telling to us, and I really enjoyed hearing it, but we would also be periodically pulled out of the story and have like a chapter in Miranda's point of view as she goes about her life. And I was simply very bored by Miranda's plotline. But that's okay, because I really liked the romance and the themes in this book. This is a bit of a spoiler for the book. I think most people know about it at this point, but as with my first reread, I think this book has a very solid message about bisexual erasure, which is what I very much related to the first time that I read it. And there's generally a lot of talk about identity, including Miranda's identity as a biracial woman, which is a thing that I think people had an issue with. Not with Miranda being a biracial woman, to be clear, but with the fact that Taylor Jenkins Reid, a white woman, was writing this story about a biracial woman and a darker-skinned Latinx woman. And there are a lot of people who think she really didn't do it well, and I can't speak to that, I don't really know. So I would recommend seeking out reviews of people who have more of an insight into it and decide for yourself if you're cool with it. But what I love about her books is really that the characters are so human. And by human, I mean, I think all of her characters are very much morally gray. I think they have a lot of flaws. They've made a lot of mistakes and a lot of decisions that just looking at them, you think that they're immoral. But the way Taylor Jenkins Reid writes these characters, it's easier to sympathize with them and see their immoral decisions and think to yourself, I understand why they did that, you know? And it kind of creates conflicted feelings about whether or not you like these people or you don't like these people. And it raises some questions about morality and how much you're willing to forgive people for the things that they do. By the way, before I forget, I want to give you trigger warnings for domestic abuse and alcoholism. As for the main romance, I mean, what can I say besides I loved it. I loved the main romance. There were a lot of trials to it. Again, these are flawed people and relationships come with a lot of hardships, especially when you're a starlet in the public's eye, and it talks about that a lot. But I loved the love story, and I loved the way Evelyn talked about her one true love. She basically talked about them as if she could hardly breathe. She was so in love with them, and that's so sweet. I am so mad at myself. I went through that entire section on the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I literally have the physical copy, but I didn't hold it up, which means I now have to edit in the photo. I could have had one less photo to edit in. Anyway, I remembered to grab the physical copy of the next book, which is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is a contemporary romance book between the American president's son and the Prince of England. Honestly, I'm gonna kind of breeze through what I have to say about this book, because with this and the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, those books have been talked about to the death on BookTube. I don't think you really need my individual perspective on these because it's not a unique perspective. I thought this book was just as good on the second read as it was on the first. I love the relationship between the 2 main characters, Alex and Henry. We have a rivals to friends to lovers story, and I very much appreciate that they actually do the friends portion of that justice. Like, you don't just breeze through it, like they're genuinely friends. They really talk to each other about the issues that they're going through, and they understand each other. I think their banter is fantastic. Anytime I read a romance, I'm very much focusing on banter and whether or not it's there, because I think banter says a lot about chemistry between a couple. And then once the romance starts, it makes me melt. It's so cute. It's so heartwarming. There is a series of letters that they send each other in the middle of this book, and I'm just saying, if someone wrote to me the way that they wrote to each other, I'd die. Beyond the main couple, I think all of the relationships in this book are really good. You have some great friend groups. You have some great parent relationships, you know, parents that are actually supportive of their children. There were some moments where I was just so touched by the support that Alex and Henry had in their lives. Also, there is conflict regarding this book because the original edition of it has mentions of Israel, and it also has several mentions of Harry Potter. And in case you didn't know, the latest editions of the book have those mentions all changed. They've been swapped out with other things. So if you want to read the book but you don't want either of those things mentioned, the newest copies should have that. And that is it for my June wrap up. I hope y'all enjoyed. If you have any opinions on any of the books that I read, please let me know in the comment section down below. I hope y'all have a great day, friends. I will see you in the next one.